Wait, Jesus wasn't the first Messiah?
Nope.
There were many, many messiahs before Jesus of Nazareth. In this video specifically, we will only be talking about one Messiah, Hezekiah, the bandit chief, Chief Hezekiah, the captain robber. It really depends on how you interpret the Greek in your translation of it. But that is the Messiah that we are talking about today. He will be the fifth Messiah of this series. I don't know if you've looked at the playlist already of the Messiahs before Jesus, but Chief Hezekiah will be the fifth Messiah of this series of Messiahs before Jesus. If you remember, the fourth Messiah of the series covered the life, actions, and behavior of one Judas ben Hezekiah. Ben being the Hebrew of son of. So Judas ben Hezekiah of the fourth video of the series is the son of this guy that we're talking about today, Chief Hezekiah, the bandit chief, captain robber. Sorry if my voice is a little funky. I'm kind of sick, but we're getting over it. Definitely check out the playlist Messiahs Before Jesus to learn about these other Messiahs if you have not already. This Chief Hezekiah is not to be confused with King Hezekiah of Judah, who lived about 700 years before Chief Hezekiah. This Chief Hezekiah in this video. Here we'll look at all the primary source text referring to Chief Hezekiah and review commentary from leading scholars about his life. The object of this video is solely to give an overview of the life of Chief Hezekiah. It is not to defend the idea that he was a Messiah, give any comprehensive definition of the word Messiah, review the origins of the term, its historical uses, or cultural connotations. A video about those topics is coming soon, so make sure to keep an eye out for it. In this video, firstly, we are going to comparatively analyze Josephus' remarks about the subject of this video, Chief Hezekiah, versus his reference to Jesus of Nazareth. Then we'll talk about Hezekiah's life and times while looking at important commentary from scholars. Then we'll look at all the primary source text from which this information derives. Before we address the accounts in Josephus about each of these messiahs, Chief Hezekiah and Jesus of Nazareth, I need to address an error that I made in this respect. In the first 4 videos about different messiahs before Jesus, I stated that there were 187 words written in Greek Josephus in the most recent translation found in the Loeb Classical Library. This is incorrect. There are 187 words written about Jesus of Nazareth, but in the older translation by William Whiston, I confused the accounts. I thought that I was utilizing the most recent translation, but in fact I was not. Actually, the correct number of words written by Josephus about Jesus of Nazareth, according to my analysis, in the most recent translation of the Loeb Classical Library, is 163. So this will be the count that we will utilize in comparisons from this time forward, and we can kind of utilize that number as a revision for the previous number given, which was incorrect. I apologize. So with this correct number in our comparison, we see that Josephus in his Greek,
the English translation of Greek Josephus, not the English translation of Slavonic Josephus,
wrote 163 words about Jesus of Nazareth, including the complete Testimonium Flavianum, which in fact Josephus did not write every word of. I'm pretty generous when it comes to this word count of words written about Jesus of Nazareth. So 163 words written about Jesus. And referring to Chief Hezekiah, he wrote 189 words. This means Josephus wrote at least 16% more about Chief Hezekiah than Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord of all.
Again, this is counting the complete Testimonium Flavianum, which Christians largely forged onto the pen of Josephus. Why did Christians feel like they needed to insert additional information about Jesus into Josephus's history?
Chief Hezekiah is not a prominent figure in ancient literature. Although he is mentioned 5 times in our ancient literary corpus, not much information is given about this guy. Pretty brief remarks are made. From what we know, he lived in one of the most chaotic periods of Jewish history, declared chief in an ambiguous moment in Jewish government. The date of his birth is not reported by Josephus, the only author who mentions him, but we read he was the renowned leader of a group of bandits in Galilee circa 47 BCE. This group of brigands was formed in the aftermath of a brutal civil war among the Jews, which was the undoing of the Hasmonean Kingdom, a kingdom which had given the Jews a century of relative stability and freedom. It was during this civil war that Rome saw its God-sent opportunity and subsequently took the temple at Jerusalem, solidifying their involvement in Jewish politics and affairs. During this Roman imposition and flux in Jewish government, about the time young Herod was entrusted with Galilee, Hezekiah was called chief among his Galilean bandits and actively battled the opposition in the name of Jewish sovereignty. Seeing this band of Jews as a threat and desirous to increase his favor with the Romans, Herod captured Chief Hezekiah and executed him. Now let's hear what Horsley has to say. Quote, Hezekiah's band of brigands had been active along the Syrian border. Although we have no precise evidence from either of Josephus's reports, we can surmise from the particular circumstances of the time that these bandits were victims of and fugitives from the shifting economic and political situation and the newly gained power of the local nobles. Concerning their possible robbing the rich and giving to the poor, we have no evidence, but they do appear to have been on good terms with the people in Galilee. They were certainly not seen as enemies of the people. They apparently plundered primarily in Syria, not in Galilee. The Syrians may have been pleased by Herod's destruction of the brigands, but there was a substantial outcry among the Galileans and even an official protest in Jerusalem. For the mothers of the men who had been murdered by Herod every day in the temple kept begging the king and the people to have Herod brought to judgment in the Sanhedrin for what he had done. Moreover, the Jewish elders charged Herod before Hyrcanus with killing Hezekiah and his men, quote, in violation of the law which forbids us, this is Josephus, he's quoting Josephus, so Josephus is saying us as in the Jews. So, quote, in violation of the law which forbids us to slay a man, even an evildoer, unless he has first been condemned. He has dared to do this without authority from you, unquote.
Horsley, Josephus and the Bandits. Journal for the Study of Judaism, pages 53 and 54.
There is a bibliography in the description as well. Hengel gives valuable commentary in his book, The Zealots. Quote, a unified aim and firmly established forms of organization are not to be found either in the case of Hezekiah and his band or in that of the later robbers of Galilee. The disturbances were an expression of a deep longing for freedom in Galilee. It cannot, however, be disputed that this quest for freedom had a religious foundation, since the Galileans refused to recognize a ruler whose person and rule were not in accordance with the law.
Hengel, The Zealots, page 317.
Farmer informs us, quote, Hezekias, and Farmer spells his name with an H and ends it with an S, Hezekias, or Hezekias, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But how this name is written depends on how you translate the Greek. And so Farmer has his name this way. Hezekias was no ordinary brigand chieftain. In the most modern translation of Josephus in the Low Classical Library, his name is written as Ezekias, without an H. He goes on to say, the hill country of Galilee was his base of operations, but his guerrilla warfare was directed against the Syrian villages across the northern border of Galilee. Herod, by executing Hezekias, ingratiated himself with these Syrians, and also with the Roman governor of Syria, who just happened to be a relative of the great Caesar. The principal men among the Jews insisted that Herod be brought to trial for this act. Herod was brought to trial, and the Sanhedrin was ready to pronounce the sentence of death upon him, when, under pressure from the Roman governor of Syria, the weakling Hyrcanus informed Herod of the probable verdict and allowed him to flee Jerusalem. This incident suggests the possibility that Hezekias was a man of some importance for the Jerusalem aristocracy.
Farmer, Judas, Simon, and Otheranges. New Testament Studies Journal. Pages 150 and 151.
Because of the scarcity of information Josephus gives us regarding Chief Hezekiah, which information we will take a look at here shortly, we're naturally wondering more about this man's background and potential affiliations. Scholars have proposed a few ideas to fill this vacancy, ideas on which their opinions differ greatly, likely due to the lack of evidence. One of these proposed ideas is Chief Hezekiah and his followers were a remnant Aristobulan army left after the civil war between brothers Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. Farmer writes, in all probability, Hezekiah and his men were nothing less than remnants of the border troops, which before the coming of Herod into Galilee had been charged with the responsibility of guarding the northern boundaries of the Maccabean Kingdom, unquote. That's in Judas, Simon, and Otheranges, page 151. Loftus agrees, quote, we concur with Wellhausen and Farmer that Ezekias was the leader of an old established Hasmonean force which had been placed by Aristobulus in Galilee to protect the borders of the land, unquote. That's in Loftus's article, The Anti-Roman Revolts of the Jews and the Galileans, on page 82. Horsley and Hengel disagree with this, and it's hard to refute their reasoning. Hengel writes, quote, these lestai, and lestai is the Greek for robbers or bandits. These lestai then were presumably not real robbers, nor were they the scattered followers of Aristobulus and his family, since in that case, the anger of Hyrcanus over the annihilation of his most dangerous enemies would be incomprehensible. So he's saying it doesn't make sense that Hyrcanus would be in favor of bringing Herod to justice, castigating Herod, and holding him responsible for the execution of Chief Hezekiah if Hezekiah and his followers simply were a remnant Aristobulan army, because they were just at war. Previous to any mentioning of Chief Hezekiah, Josephus talks about the civil war, and Hyrcanus and Aristobulus were enemies. They were the cause of this civil war, their battle for the kingship. He goes on to say, what is more, it is noteworthy that Josephus never calls the followers of Aristobulus robbers. So in the literature previous to mentioning Chief Hezekiah, there is no mentioning of lestai in reference to the men of Aristobulus's armies. They're never called lestai until Chief Hezekiah comes on the stage, and then he is called the archelestai, the arch robber, the captain, bandit, chief bandit, however you want to translate that. It is therefore reasonable, he goes on, to assume that Hezekiah fought in his own cause, and that he may have gathered an armed force around him with the approval of the Sadducees in Galilee in order to form a counterbalance to the increasing strength of the Edomite Antipater and his sons. Hezekiah was a man of rank and influence, and he may have belonged to the Clurukoi, who had been settled in Galilee by Alexander Jannaeus. It is hardly possible to describe him as the founder of the Zealot party. He was at best a precursor.
Hengel, The Zealots, page 315.
Horsley preserves the same reasoning. Quote, for mothers to bewail their dead sons is only what we would expect. Their sons in this case, however, were outlaws killed by the established political authority. There are, then, further implications to Josephus's reports. From both reports together, it is evident that Hezekiah and his bandits cannot be dismissed as merely the remnants of the Galilean partisans of Aristobulus, else their relatives would not now be appealing to Hyrcanus, and Hyrcanus, for his part, would be looking on them as more serious enemies, unquote. And that's in Josephus and the Bandits, page 54. It seems more likely to me that Chief Hezekiah and his followers were not a remnant Aristobulan army, but rather had their own distinct form, one fundamentally driven in nationalism and contempt for the nascent imperial situation. As Hengel said, it likely had a religious foundation as well in Roman Palestinian antiquity, there was no concept of separation of church and state as we understand it today. Especially in Jewish culture, they viewed Yahweh as the supreme leader, the God of the whole earth. And so Chief Hezekiah surely felt that the laws of Yahweh should be implemented on the land, and that there should be a king, a Jewish king, to rule over his people. Another idea which may help us understand the story of Chief Hezekiah and his life is his potential tie to royal lineage. This outline in Zealots shows the genealogy of Chief Hezekiah, which Hengel calls a dynasty. Chief Hezekiah was the first in Josephus to be called a lestai, specifically archelestai, the chief robber, chief bandit. His son Judas, who we covered in the fourth video of the series, Judas ben Hezekiah, had royal ambitions. And Judas's son, or grandson, we're not exactly sure, was clearly a messianic pretender. This theme in this family, in conjunction with other contextual details, has caused some scholars to propose the idea that there is a tie to Hasmonean or Davidic ancestry. And then you see here in this outline in Zealots, this is on page 332, Hengel has some confusion. In my opinion, he's confused about the identity of Judas and Sepphoris and Judas the Galilean. He has an equal sign here saying Judas and Sepphoris is the same as Judas the Galilean. I think they are different people, along with many scholars. Farmer writes pertaining to Chief Hezekiah and his followers, quote, "We may assume, therefore, that at least some of these officers of these border guards were supplied by the leading families of Jerusalem, among whom the martial traditions of the early Maccabean period were no doubt kept alive long after the spiritual fires of the revolution had burned low. This Jerusalem aristocracy, like the ruling class of any monarchy, was bound together by intermarriage with the royal house." Hengel retorts, quote, "W.R. Farmer's conjecture that a close relative of the Hasmonean royal house was involved here is probably completely erroneous," unquote. That's in Zealots, page 315. And instead, in another section of his book, The Zealots, Hengel proposes a tie to Davidic ancestry. Quote, "The formation of the dynasty, which presumably extended from Hezekiah to Eleazar ben Ari, and the messianic ambition that was clearly discernible in that dynasty in at least one case, which is the case of Menachem, can be explained most satisfactorily by assuming that the claim to Davidic descent was made in that family," unquote. That's on page 300. He then cites Joachim Jeremias as one in favor of this proposal as well of Davidic descent. To me, it seems very difficult to make a conclusion here. I think Farmer's reasoning is very persuasive, and probably his proposal of Hasmonean lineage is more likely than Hengel's. But I don't think that we can say that either proposal is likely in general. We simply don't know if there were any claims to Davidic or Hasmonean ancestry here. Okay, now we'll look at all the primary source material regarding Chief Hezekiah. Obviously, there is other ancillary texts that we can look to glean details about the story of Chief Hezekiah and his life. But when I review the primary source text for each of these Messiah figures, I only review sentences specifically containing a direct reference to that individual and their actions. It should be noted too that Josephus, in a strict sense, is not a primary source for the life of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was probably born about a century before Josephus was even born. Josephus was not there to witness anything that happened during the life of Chief Hezekiah. He did not interview anyone that was alive during the life of Chief Hezekiah. However, this is the best we have. So chronologically, I'll go through these sources from Jewish War, which was written 75 to 79 CE, through Antiquities, which was written circa 95 CE. I'll go through them from the first verses to the later verses. So in Jewish War, Book 1, Chapter 10, Verse 5, we read, quote, "Herod, energetic by nature, at once found material to test his mettle," meaning to test his courage, his fortitude. Discovering that Ezekias, a brigand chief at the head of a large horde, was ravaging the district on the Syrian frontier, he caught him and put him and many of the brigands to death. Unquote. Also in Jewish War, Book 2, Chapter 4, Verse 1, we read, quote, "At Sepphoris in Galilee, Judas, son of Ezekias, the brigand chief who in former days infested the country and was subdued by King Herod, raised a considerable body of followers, broke open the royal arsenals, and having armed his companions, attacked the other aspirants to power." So that's mainly focused on Judas ben Hezekiah, which the son of Chief Hezekiah. We already talked about Judas in another video. And these instances are quite repetitive. As you can tell, Jewish War and Antiquities have parallel accounts often, and they have a lot of the same details about historical events. So going on to Antiquities, Book 14, Chapter 9, Verse 2, we read, quote, "For on learning that Ezekias, a bandit leader, was overrunning the borders of Syria with a large troop, he caught and killed him, and many of the bandits with him," unquote. And just in the next verse, Antiquities, Book 14, Chapter 9, Verse 3, we read, quote, "Thus Herod, his son, has killed Ezekias and many of his men in violation of our law, which forbids us to slay a man, even an evildoer, unless he was first been condemned by the Sanhedrion to suffer this fate." Sanhedrion here as Sanhedrin. That was in Antiquities. And then also our last instance of any reference to Chief Hezekiah is in Antiquities, Book 17, Chapter 10, Verse 5. Quote, "Then there was Judas, the son of the brigand chief Ezekias, who had been a man of great power and had been captured by Herod only with great difficulty," unquote. And so those are the only 5 references in all of ancient literature to this man, Chief Hezekiah, this Messiah. There is another potential reference to Chief Hezekiah in Jewish literature about a little over 100 years after Josephus wrote Antiquities. This is found in a tractate of the Mishnah, the Shabbat. And here we read about Hananiah ben Hezekiah ben Gerin. And so there are no specific details about Chief Hezekiah, potentially Chief Hezekiah, or in any sense, the Hezekiah mentioned here in Shabbat. It only refers to Hananiah and what they did with regard to the book of Ezekiel in attempting to keep it in the canon. Make sure to check out the bibliography in the description. Almost all these sources are free. You can go on to sources like JSTOR.org, or there's a website that I've been using pretty frequently nowadays, the Z Library Project. The URL is in the description. It's a weird URL though. It's like u1lib.org or something like that. But excellent resources to find literature for free. A lot of this stuff is in the Josephus is in the public domain. I've already talked about that before. You'll get an old translation probably by William Whiston, but you'll still be able to read Antiquities and Jewish War.